Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Natalie from Orchid, and today Anne and I will go through some tips to get started and to use EFT processing for Sage 300. Before we dive into the details, let's review some key questions around EFT processing. Do you need to send payments electronically to vendors and employees, collect receipts from your customers via direct debit, or send positive pay files to your bank if you're paying vendors by check? How confident are you that all your cash movements are secure and would stand up to an audit? Would you like to cut costs and improve efficiency through increased automation, enhance auditability, reduce exposure to fraud by moving away from paper checks and streamlining positive pay file processing? EFT processing lets you do all this. You can pay your vendor invoices, streamline your customer refunds. On the receipt front, you can use direct debits if you have recurring rents, subscriptions, and you can pay employees by EFT if you're using Sage 300 US or Canadian Payroll. With EFT processing, you have increased accuracy, security, and auditability, as all your changes are audited in EFT. It supports remote working and the paperless office. You don't need to have the check signed. You can email the remittance advices, the pay slips, remuneration statements, and other payroll-related documents. There are numerous security features, such as the ability to encrypt your own bank details, the vendor, customer, and employees' bank details, the ability to encrypt the PDF that includes the detail of the remittance advice. And overall, with faster processing, you have happier customers, vendors, and employees. As many of you are aware, EFT processing supports hundreds of bank formats around the world, and we create new ones on request for supported version of Sage 300 at no extra cost. So your savings on your bank transaction fees, you don't need paper check stationery, you print less, and you have less handling and postage costs. And with the automatic file creation, you don't have to duplicate the data entry into your banking software. So the ROI for EFT processing, and there is an ROI calculator available on the Orchid website, is generally very quick. So many of you would have seen these screens before. To set up EFT processing, we have a whole lot of options to decide how you're going to be using EFT. You enter the bank details for your own banks, and then banking details for your EFT vendors. There are some additional features of EFT processing that relate to the receipting process, where you can automatically create receipt batches based on a range of invoices, and you can also update the invoice due date so that the AR invoices can be included in a receipt batch more easily. There are a whole lot of audit features and reports, and we will go through this in the next 45 minutes in a series of frequently asked questions. EFT processing is available on the Sage 300 web screens, where you can set up your vendors, your customers, you can create EFT file, and you can email remittance advice using the Sage 300 web screens. If you are new to EFT processing, you would often start on the Orchid website on the EFT processing page. And as you know, there are a lot of resources at the bottom of the page, including some overviews and brochure if you need it for your clients, some training video for EFT, APAR, and for Payroll, a few spotlight videos on key features in EFT processing, including the ROI calculator that we talked about earlier. The resources are also available in the online help, resources online help, and that is open to everyone, users and partners. So if we go to EFT processing for Sage 300 help, here we have access to the APAR training video as well as the Payroll training video. And we have some key steps to get started with the different components of EFT processing. Common question at this time of the year, soon after Sage 300 releases a new version, is what do we need to do to upgrade? And the key steps are presented here in the help. First, you install and activate. You need to transfer your user formats if you're using user formats. So you would copy your user formats INI file from the Sage program directories from the old EL folder to the new one. So for 2024, it's going to be EL71A. Or if you're using customization directory, you also need to update it to read the new version. And then you can run a test file after the upgrade and make sure that you're getting the same results as with your existing file format. If you have some custom forms for your remittance advice, you also need to copy them in the appropriate EL/ENG folder or in the customization directory. The web screens for EFT processing have been available for a couple of years now, and they're getting more and more popular. So we often have the question, how do I install the EFT processing web screens? Do I need to tick a particular box in the install files? No, you don't, because the web screens for Orchid EFT rely on Extender for the ease of deployment and maintenance. So to run the EFT processing web screens, you need to install and activate Extender, even if you don't have a license for Extender. If you're upgrading and you're upgrading the web screens, you need to install and activate the new version of Extender. And you activate it in all the companies where you want to use the web screens. And this is presented in more detail, including a video here in the help. We won't look at that in detail today, but this is just a reminder that the information is there, and also a reminder to upgrade Extender if you're upgrading the web screens. Very common questions we have, and that applies to both AP, AR, and is how can I change the labels on the EFT vendor and customer screens? Basically, the labels in the EFT vendor and EFT customer screens are driven by what you select on the primary file type tab in EFT options. So if you can't see certain field labels in EFT vendors or EFT customers, it's often because the EFT primary bank field is blank. So let's look at this in EFT options. So if I go to EFT processing, EFT setup, options. On the primary file type tab, if I select CAN CPA 005 and look at my EFT vendor, I'm seeing these fields. I'm going to close this screen again, change the primary file type to, I'll change the primary file type to an ISO 222 file type. If I now reopen the vendor screen, you see I have different fields available. My country code is 2 characters, got my IBAN and my big Swift with a tooltip in there. So this primary file type on the EFT options applies to AP and AR. For EFT employees, it is on the Payroll tab in EFT options, which is currently not enabled on this machine. On this screen, we also have encrypt bank BSB account number, and this is the ability to encrypt your own bank details in EFT Bank. So if I turn this on here and save this option, then in EFT Banks, if I log in as admin, I have access to everything, so I can see the full bank account number. But if I log in as a user that has only enter rights in my EFT security group, so we choose EFT processing here. On the enter to be able to view the full account numbers, I need to have access to view unencrypted bank account details. A few file formats include a bank description that is entered when you create the EFT file. We often have the question as to whether we can save the settings. So for example, in the ACH file format, the company entry description in the file is based on that description in the Create EFT file screen. So if you're using the same one for every AP payment you're making, you can enter the description first time, click on settings, save the settings, and then the screen will default to that. So let's look at this now in Sage 300. So I'm going to create EFT file. And you can see the description defaults to my EFT file. So I can change it to that, go to settings, save the settings as default. So if I close the screen and reopen it, I should have my new settings, my EFT file webinar. Similarly, if I want to clear it all, I can clear the saved settings. In the latest product updates of version 2021 and above, released since October last year, this description, as well as the effective file date, the effective EFT payment date that sometimes pops up on the file if your format supports it, are now saved in the EFT log. So I can save those settings, and then they're available in the log file, which leads us to related questions is, can I delete the audit records of completed EFT files? By default, EFT Processing will keep all transactions until you elect to clear the completed transactions from the log files. Most people would generally leave it in there for a long time. This information is needed if you want to print or reprint remittance advices. So once the data is purged, it's gone, it's not available for reporting. So you could just export the data and save it somewhere and then clear the transactions if you want to do that. And let's look at that in Sage 300 using the view and clear completed EFT logs in periodic processing. So I could keep everything that's from 2023 and 2024, but I want to clear the old EFT file creation. So on the up to creation number, I can put 3 and hit clear, asking me to confirm and reminding me that this data is required to print remittance advices. So if I go yes, the screen is refreshed and I don't have my older logs in there. Same process applies to delete other type of logs for your payroll logs or EFT audit logs, which is all changes that you've done to EFT vendor and EFT customers' bank details. So you might want to clear really old ones. EFT file format is a critical component of EFT processing, and most of you would be familiar with the process of getting a new file format. You send us the bank specs, you send us a sample file. That's the ideal scenario. We might tell you, try this format, test it, and based on the bank's feedback, we will amend it, create a new one, or create a user format. You can't change anything in the formats.ini. So if you need to change a file format in EFT, you have to do it in a user format. If you were to change the formats.ini and you start creating an EFT file, you will get a file hash error. So when we send you a new format, generally we would suggest you copy it in the customization directory. Occasionally you have done your own changes. That is a little bit of a quirky tip, but you do your own changes to the format and you can see the file format is there. It's in the right spot in the customization directory, and EFT can't find it. It says this format doesn't exist. We have had the odd issue where the problem was the file was actually not saved in the right format. You had done your changes in Notepad, but the file was not saved as a UTF-8 encoding. So all user formats need to use that UTF-8 encoding when saving the file. We get many support questions relating to emailing with EFT processing. That applies to emailing EFT vendors remittance advice, AR customers direct debit advices, and payroll advices, pay stubs, T4, T4A, Releve 1. These questions seem to come back because security changes in the underlying SMTP servers, IT teams do changes to the emailing environment, in particular when you move to a new server or during an upgrade, and sometimes the related EFT email settings may need adjustments. Our first question is, do I have to fill in the SMTP details in EFT options? Short answer is no, you don't have to. If you leave the SMTP blank in EFT processing options on the AP email tab, the Sage 300 default way of sending emails will be used. So it's going to use the SMTP details on the Sage 300 company profile, or it's going to use Outlook on your client machine if those details are sent blank. This works fine. However, there's a couple of restrictions in terms of what EFT can do. We can't verify that the email is actually being sent, so we're not reporting the number of emails that are sent. We can't then track whether to resend or not. The print advice screen will not have the box that says, do you want to send, even if the email's already been sent. And if you want to use the ability to password protect the PDF that is attached to the emails, you have to use EFT's SMTP options. More and more people use Office 365 to email out of EFT and other Orchid modules. So yes, you can email with Office 365, and the exact steps depend on your Office 365 configuration. You have the choice between using SMTP with basic authentication, if basic authentication is enabled on your Office 365 server, and you can use a username and a password, or if you're using multi-factor authentication, you can then use a username and an app password. If basic authentication is turned off on your Office 365 setup altogether, you have to use Microsoft Graph. So let's look at this in EFT setup, and we'll cover a few other questions at the same time. So here I've chosen to email with SMTP. The other option is Microsoft Graph. The email server will generally be smtp.office365.com:587. You generally have to add the default port because there is no port field, email server port field on the screen. We often ask, how do I enter the port? You enter the port number in the email server field by putting the colon and the port number. Here it's 587, which is the default SMTP port, but it could be something else. Then you enter your username and a password. If you're using an app password, you enter the app password in here, and it's still the same username. For the encryption, you would generally use TLS, and that leads us to a common support question, which is, what TLS version does EFT processing use? And you don't actually select the TLS version, but Orchid uses the .NET SMTP client class, which will use whatever is configured on your server based on the .NET version installed. We currently support TLS all the way to TLS 1.3, and if need be, when there are changes in SMTP, you would then rebuild as required. So if you have any issues emailing that seem to relate to the TLS version, the first step is always to download and install the latest product update for your Sage 300 version. So if we go back to our EFT option, another important option, which is not new but is probably used more regularly now, is the ability to limit how many emails you can send per minute or per session. And again, this depends on your email server. So with Office 365, it's generally a limit per minute. And if you're using Gmail to email, it would be a limit per session. Another frequent question is, can you email remittance advices to multiple email addresses? The answer is yes, because the email to field in EFT vendor and EFT customer and EFT employee is 250 characters long. So you can enter multiple email addresses separated by a semicolon. If we look at this in EFT vendors, if we select EFT vendor email to, here I can enter 2 email addresses. test@orchid.systems and support@orchid.systems, separated by semicolon. If you don't want to enter specific email addresses for the EFT vendor, you can choose your AP vendor delivery method, and then it is the email configured on the AP vendor that's going to be used when you email the remittance advice. So we suggest that if you are using AP vendor delivery method, you don't use multiple contact in AP. So if you use multiple contact in AP, in EFT, use EFT vendor email to and include however many email addresses you need in here. We currently don't support Sage 300 multiple contacts in EFT processing. We've just looked at a few common support questions regarding emailing with EFT. Now let's focus on some questions specific to using EFT processing with AP payments and AP vendor. We've touched on the first question at the beginning. How can I change labels on the EFT vendor and the EFT customer screen using the primary file tab in EFT options? Next, we're going to look at creating a positive pay file with EFT processing, and for this I'm going to hand over to Anne.
My name's Anne from Orchid Systems. Positive pay. Why do we have it? What is it? And when do we use it? Positive pay is a process of validating or confirming the key details of the check to deter check fraud. A positive pay file contains all the information printed on the check. It includes the payee's name, check number, check amount, check date, amongst other data, depending on the bank. The bank then uses this positive pay file and the details to electronically match the check being presented to the bank. Prior to the check being presented to the bank for payment, the bank needs to process the positive pay EFT file. So after printing your checks and sending them off, you should send the positive pay file to the bank. How do we produce a positive pay file? First, you create your payments, print the checks, and post the AP payment batch or the AR refund batch, or do your payroll run and print the checks. And then you use create EFT file or create EFT payroll file to create the file for the bank based on the AP payment batch number, the AR refund batch number, or the payroll run end date. And before you click create, you change the EFT file format to the required EFT positive pay format for your bank. In this case, the Bank of Montreal. For positive pay files, you do not need to set up the EFT vendor or EFT customer records. You do not need to fill in account numbers, etc. Unless you want to email the vendor or customer a remittance advice using the email address on the EFT vendor record or the EFT customer record. I'm going to demonstrate now how to create a positive pay file from an AP payment batch and from a payroll run. In EFT Processing, once we've created the accounts payable payment batch or the accounts receivable refund, you can go to Create EFT File, select the accounts payable payment batch or the refund batch number, and then you would override the EFT file type with the one that you need for the bank. So depending on your bank, you select their positive pay format and then go ahead and create. And the positive pay file is created based on the bank's specification, in this case, the Bank of Montreal. And similarly, for your payroll checks, you would go to Create EFT Payroll File, enter the appropriate payroll run date, and then if the correct format does not default from the bank, it can be overridden to the required format, and then you would go ahead and create an EFT file. The EFT file is formatted according to the bank's positive pay specification. The configuration required for positive pay files in the EFT options and EFT banks, it differs if you're creating only positive pay files in a Sage 300 company or if you need to do positive pay files as well as EFT files. So if you're only creating positive pay files in a Sage 300 company, you configure the positive pay EFT file type as your primary EFT file type in the EFT setup options on the primary file type tab for AP and AR and on the payroll tab for payroll. And then on the appropriate banks, you configure the positive pay EFT file type on the EFT bank, for AP and AR on the payments and refunds tab, and for payroll on the payroll tab. And then when you come to create the EFT file and you select the batch or the payroll run to pay, the correct EFT file type will default and you won't need to override it. And we saw this in the payroll example that I've just done. But if you're doing both EFT and positive pay files in the same Sage 300 company, you would configure the appropriate EFT file type for your EFT files in the EFT options on the primary file type tab and on the payroll tab. And this will cause EFT Processing to add the correct fields to the EFT vendor, EFT customer, and EFT employee screens so that you can fill in the appropriate account numbers, etc., that the bank requires. And then on the EFT file type for the AP payment or on the payroll tab for payroll, you would fill in the EFT file type. And this means when you come to create the EFT file, once you've selected the appropriate batch or payroll run, you will need to override the EFT file format with the positive pay format when you're doing positive pay. And we saw that in the AP example that I've just done. Can you configure the system to avoid having to change the EFT file type before clicking Create on the Create EFT File screen? Yes, this can be done by using an EFT clearing bank account for the EFT payments. You would configure the EFT file format on the EFT bank for the clearing bank account. Let's say, for example, this is where we're going to post our EFT file, CPA 005. And then you would enter and post your AP payments or the AR refund or your payroll against this EFT clearing bank account. When you click Post, the details of the payment post to the clearing bank account. For AP payments only, an automated bank transfer between the clearing account and the real bank account is done so that on the clearing account you see the details of each and every payment, but on the real bank account you see the single withdrawal in total. And this aids your bank reconciliation when your EFT payments are done or shown in total on your bank rec. For the AR refunds and payroll, the bank transfer between the clearing account and the real bank account must be done manually. And then when you go to select the AP payment batch or the AR receipt batch or the payroll file in Create EFT File, the correct EFT file format will default. You do not need to change anything. And then on the real bank account, you configure it for your positive pay. You enter and post the AP payments against the real bank account. The details of the payments are posted to the real bank account, which for checks aids your reconciliation. And then when you select the AP payment batch or the AR refund batch or the payroll, the positive pay file type automatically defaults on the Create EFT screen. You do not need to change it.
Next question, do I need to specify the file type in EFT Vendor? The file type field is an option. You only see it on the EFT Vendor screen if the option is enabled in EFT options. And you would then get a finder to select the vendor as well as a finder to select the EFT file type. So you can record different bank details for the same vendors based on the file type you use. So if you're paying the same vendor in domestic currency using a particular file format, and for international transfers using a different file format, you may need to turn this option. So by default it is not enabled, and we have set an example here of the steps to actually set that up, set a vendor with multiple file type in the help. So we're not going to go through all the steps one by one. I'm going to show you the EFT options screen where we select allow multiple vendor account. Then you enter the different bank details for the vendor and the different file types, and then when you create your EFT file, depending on the file type, the bank payment or the file type selected on the Create EFT File screen, EFT will pick up the right details. Let's look at this in Sage 300 on EFT options. On the AP tab, I have selected allow multiple vendor bank account details, and on the EFT vendor I now have this EFT file type fields that I can fill in. If I leave it blank, it's going to be the default one that is used for file types that are not configured. So here for vendor 1200, I've got some specific bank account details that I want to use when I use the CAN CPA 005 BT file format. But if the file type is blank, I'm using different bank account. So this is a scenario where you have different vendor details depending on the file type. You also have a scenario where a vendor may have multiple bank accounts. And this is where you would use the remit to field. If a vendor only has one bank account, you leave the vendor remit to code blank. So regardless of the vendor remit to address that you use on your AP payments, you will use the same bank account details. But the remit to field gives you the option to record different vendor bank details for each remit to locations that has been set up in AP. So if we go back to Sage 300, here for no remit to, I'm using these details, but for the PO box remit to, I'm using some other bank details. Finally, let's look at the different types of AP remittance advice layout that we can use. We've looked at the email addresses that are used when you're emailing vendors or customers or employees. The remittance advice are standard crystal report that you can customize to suit your business requirements, such as adding a logo. EFT Processing installs with 4 different templates. We added a new one recently, EL Pay 05, where the payment date on the remittance advice is based on the effective date selected when the EFT file is created. So this only applies for certain file formats which support an effective date. And in the most recent product updates, this effective date is now stored in the EFT log. Therefore, it can be used in the remittance advice. So we've looked at a few tips specific to using EFT processing for AP payments. Let's now move to using EFT processing with AR customers and receipts and refund payments. So you can create EFT files for AR refunds and AR receipt batches. We won't look at that because the process is very similar to what you can do with EFT for AP. But we will focus on some useful features that are part of EFT processing that help your AR customer process. Question relating to specifying the file type in EFT customers. It is very similar to AP vendor. You need to enable the option in EFT setup options on the AR tab to allow multiple customer bank account details, one per EFT file type, in which case you can then enter different bank account details for the different file types. When you then leave the file type blank on this screen, the labels on the EFT customer screen will depend on the primary bank setup in EFT options. So if we look at this in EFT options, the AR tab, we don't have allow multiple customer bank account details turned on. So if I look at customers, I can't select a file type on customers, and that is the default setup. If I need to change this, then I would turn this option here, save, then reopen the EFT customer screen, and now I have a file type available. With EFT processing for AR, you can use it to create AR batches in bulk based on your posted AR invoices. What type of batches can you create? A few years ago, we added the ability to create refund batches from AR documents. And you can also create zero value AR receipt batches, which let you apply documents between customers. And this is a very useful function that mimics the function to create AP payment batches in bulk for AP vendor invoices. We have detailed steps on how to use this process in the help, but basically the first thing you need to do is in your EFT setup is to configure some receipt and refund selection codes. You need to have at least one, and that sets up some default values that are used to create the batches. So here we're saying we're going to create a receipt batch, but you have an option of zero value matched batches and refund batches. The description we're going to use, which bank it's going to be for, the payment code that we're using, and when you create such batches, the payment type will now come from the payment code that is associated with this AR payment code. You set up some default values for the batches you're going to create it, and then on the criteria tab you decide how you're going to select the AR invoices that need to be included to create those receipt batches. So there are a lot of criteria there. So you may have different receipt selection codes for different customer group, depending on whether the customer balance is in debit or in credit, depending on the billing cycle, depending on the invoice terms code, and you can also use optional fields to select the right documents, optional fields on customers as well as invoice header optional fields. You can then select which documents you're going to include. So are we including debit notes? Are we including prepayments, unapplied cash, credit notes, in evaluating the direct debit receipt amounts we need to do. And finally, you can select to exclude certain customers or certain documents from the process. If you add a record on the exclusion tab, this customer will not be included in creating the receipt batch. If you enter a national account customer number, then it's going to exclude any customer that belong to this national account. So this is part of the setup, and you need at least one. Then in EFT transaction, you can use the Create Receipt Refund Batch icon. You're going to select one of your receipt selection codes. So in our sample data, we've only got one, which is direct debit. So all the values that I've selected are defaulted, but I can change them for this particular run. I could then come and exclude a particular customer from here. So insert a row in here. I'm going to exclude Bargain Mart from this process. Could exclude a particular document or all the customers, and I go create. It's going to create an AR receipt batch. So there are a few other relevant options in here. I can choose to process a single receipt per national account, either based on the customer setting in EFT, or set it to yes or to no. I can choose to auto post the batches that are created, and I can also choose to create one receipt per invoice, or if I select no, it's going to create one receipt for all the invoices that it finds that match the criteria that I select. There is a report in EFT Processing transaction reports to log receipt batch creation. The report batch audit report that you find in EFT does not include all the batches created. It only includes the documents that you have excluded. So if we look at here at the report here under transaction reports, receipt batch audit log, I can see that when I run the process, customer 1100 Bargain Mart San Diego was actually excluded from my process. So on the receipt batch audit log inquiry screen in periodic processing, same thing, I can see the receipt selection code I selected, the time it was run, etc. And I can see and if I double click on the line, I can see the exclusions. When creating AR receipts automatically, the invoice due date is really important. So in some cases, you may want to update the due date of a posted AR invoice. You can't do that in standard Sage 300 AR, but you can do that in EFT Processing. And there's a feature called Update Invoice Due Date, which is particularly useful if you need to amend the dates for selection in the Create Receipt Batch run, or if you want to correct the date to send an AR age trial balance to the customer if you've updated if the original document date was wrong. There's a special security group for this, so you can only use this screen if the security group Update Invoice Due Date has been assigned to you. Let's look at this in Sage 300. Under EFT Transactions, Update Invoice Due Date, I can select just one customer and one document, or multiple customer per multiple documents per customers. So these are all my invoices. I could update this one to be 2024. I need to have security group for this, security rights. In EFT to update invoice due date. I'm currently logged in as admin, so I can do anything, but for a regular user, you would need to make sure they're in that update invoice due date group. So I can then process. It's updated to 2 documents. And now I can go into periodic processing and look at the inquiry. So I can see that on the 21st, I've updated those 2 dates. The original due date was 2020, it is now 2024. As we have seen for the completed EFT logs, you can clear some of these logs. So I could clear the old ones up to creation number 2, and go clear, confirm that I want to do this, and now I only have the latest documents that I have updated. Final point we want to discuss regarding EFT processing for AR is, can I email AR advices for miscellaneous receipts? Yes, you can use EFT processing to email advices for AR miscellaneous receipts, as you can with AR receipts. So that means you don't need a special process in AR to email a remittance advice for miscellaneous receipts and another one in EFT to email customers their remittance advice for direct debit. To do this, you need to have an EFT file format for miscellaneous receipts that is configured to work without having to enter the EFT details for the customer. Then you enter and post your AR miscellaneous receipts batch. You can create the EFT file, but you don't upload it to the bank. You create the EFT file and delete it. And then you can follow the print advice process to email the customer the remittance advice using the standard print advice screen. So if you need one of those formats to email miscellaneous receipts without entering the AR customer details, please let us know, and we will send you the detail of the format to use. That's what we wanted to discuss regarding using EFT processing for AR. In the final part of this presentation, we want to share a few tips regarding using EFT processing for payroll, and that is US and Canadian payroll. First question is, can I create a positive pay file with EFT processing if you are paying your employees by checks and your bank requires a positive pay file? The answer is yes, and we have demonstrated that in the using a positive pay file for AP vendors, because it is the same process. Next question is, can I encrypt payroll advices and other PDF emailed to employees? Yes, you can. You configure this in EFT option. On the payroll tab, there is an option to use the remittance advice passwords. It applies to emailing remittance advice as well as printing pay stubs, printing T4, T4As and Releve 1s when using Canadian payroll. The details are in the help there. You can configure a password formula in EFT option that will pick up some fields from your EFT employee and turn it into a password. So it could be the first 3 characters of the last name and the rightmost 4 characters of the SIN number. With a new security in Sage Payroll, if you are using the SIN number, for example, in the formula, the user who prints a remittance advice needs to have access to this field so that EFT can read it, get the characters that it needs, and build the password correctly. You can also have a password that is entered for each EFT employee. And in addition, you can configure a master password in EFT options on the payroll tab. So the master password is a general override that you can use to open the file. But if you only have a master password and you don't have a formula and no user password, then the master password doesn't come into play. If you find that you think you've configured everything, but the PDF is not encrypted, there's 2 main reasons why this could happen. First is you are not emailing using EFT's SMTP options. If you're leaving both AP email and the payroll email SMTP details blank in EFT, then the Sage default way of emailing kicks in and you cannot encrypt the PDF. And a less common scenario would be that you have only entered a master password, you don't have a formula to build a password, and you don't have an individual password for the employee, then the master password doesn't apply. Most of you are now familiar as to how to print payroll and pay stubs using EFT processing. I will just remind you that the steps are available in the help. There is a detailed video with the procedures, so we won't go through that again today. There's nothing new in that area. Just a reminder that if you want to save the pay stub on a network folder, you have to set the file path where you want to save the pay stubs in the EFT options default advice tab. It's not on the payroll tab. You just put the path and EFT will create a subfolder automatically for each Sage 300 company and a subfolder for each employee ID within that Sage 300 company. So the final tip we want to share regarding EFT for payroll is around printing T4 and T4A for Canadian payroll users. And for this, I'm going to hand over to Anne again.
In order to email employees their T4, T4A or Releve 1, you should first configure the associated government report file name in the EFT setup options on the default advice tab. To know what the file name is, preview the Sage 300 report to get the crystal report name, and then configure that file name on the default advices tab. To check the report and to get the file name, run the associated report from the payroll government reports, in this case T4. And when you print preview the report, you'll see the report file name in the header of the file. And this is the report file name that you configure in EFT options. While you're here, you can test the report and check that you're getting the appropriate employees. Notice also you get a summary report page. And if you use this report and send to each individual employee, you're going to get the individual page plus a summary page. So if you want, you can take a copy of this report and amend the report to suppress the unwanted pages and then configure that new report name in the EFT options. If you don't want to send the employees a single page report with a summary page attached, follow our knowledge base article on how to change the crystal report, and then you would configure that amended crystal report file name in the default advice tab. The next step is to check the employee configuration, their email address and which email address that you're going to use. In EFT Setup Employees, check the delivery method. Is this set to EFT employee record or CP employee record? And then on the appropriate record, check the email address. Then you should test your associated government report on a range of employees. So for that range of employees that you're going to test, change the email addresses to your own test email addresses, and we'd recommend you have multiple addresses here to check the correct report is being sent to the correct person. And you must have access to those email addresses to check the email that's sent. Then once you've run the process, check the emails and the attachments. Is it the correct details for the correct employee? Have you suppressed the summary pages correctly? And then once you're happy with this, reset the email addresses. And then you're ready to run the associated EFT transaction report. Print Payroll T4, print Payroll T4As, and print Payroll Releve 1s.
So we've shared a few tips in the various parts of EFT processing. Just a reminder of new-ish features that have come in the last, say, 2 years in EFT processing. We're adding new formats on a regular basis, and as required, amending existing formats or helping with user formats. We created more than 60 new formats across a range of countries in 2023. We find that a lot of the bank formats are more and more sophisticated, and thanks to the use of Lua functions, we can actually meet these requirements in an easier way than in the past. As we've added a new security group, the ability to recreate EFT files, think about 2 years ago, as some of you are now upgrading from older versions of Sage 300 to the latest versions and updates of EFT. You may still come across this where a user does not have rights to recreate an EFT file in their security group, so you then need to check their security group, update them so that they can recreate a file. With the clearing bank, you can now use the AP batch number in the bank transfer number that gets created. We keep improving the SFTP functionality as it is used more and more often to meet the new security requirements or the standards that might change from the bank. We have delivered the ability to support emailing with Microsoft Graph, saving a new extra fields in the audit log, updating the remittance advice. We have added the receipt batch audit log on the web screens and have been working on a lot of the other reports and inquiry screens for the web screens. So look at the news for 2024 for that. We have confirmed that T4A and related processes support the latest version of Payroll. So that includes Payroll 8 and the 2024 tax updates. There is a super view in EFT processing that helps support customizations to create the EFT file process. For example, if you need to actually encrypt the bank file before uploading to the bank. So as you probably know, EFT processing is our more popular module that works with Sage 300 as well as Sage Intacct, and we keep working on it and adding new features. We're now ready for questions. Thanks for your time.